Now, if we take a cross-section of the skin, we find it's in layers. And over the surface of the body, there's 3 clear layers that we can identify. The outer layer of the skin is called the epidermis. The thicker layer beneath that is called the dermis. And below that, there's another area called the hypodermis. So let's look at these now in diagrammatic form. So here we have the surface of the epidermis, and there's actually gaps called pores in the surface of the epidermis. We'll see what they're for in a minute. And the epidermis is actually a relatively thin layer of the skin, and it's packed full of cells. It's a very cell-rich layer, but it's relatively thin. And there's a junction between the epidermis on top and the dermis below, and that junction is wavy. So here we have the epidermis on top and the dermis below, but the junction is wavy. So epidermis on top. Dermis is the thicker layer below the epidermis. So here, on this diagram, this area here is going to be the dermis. This area here on the surface is going to be the epidermis. So epidermis, dermis. And this layer below is mostly made, on most parts of the body, of fatty tissue. It's very rich in adipocytes, fatty tissue. And this area below the dermis, what do we call it when something's below? Well, the prefix that means below is hypo. So we can call this the hypodermis, the hypodermis. Now, the reason that there's pores is that the structures go down into the lower parts of the skin from the surface. And this structure here, for example, is called a hair follicle. So hairs are all over the surface of the body. Sometimes they're long, like on your head or in a man's beard. Sometimes they're smaller, like on the back of your hand. But there's actually hairs covering most of the surface of the body. And hairs grow out of hair follicles. The follicle is this hole that goes down into the dermis, the hair follicle. And the hair itself will start growing at the bottom of this, and it will grow up out of the hair follicle like this. So here's the hair sticking out here, growing out of the hair follicle. And the other pore, types of pores, holes in the epidermis, the top layer. What we have here is a gland that produces and secretes sweat. And what we have is a sweat gland duct. These are ducted glands. And it goes down to a glandular portion down here, which is basically a coiled tube. So the sweat is produced in this glandular area here and comes up in this duct onto the surface of the body. So projecting down from the surface, through the epidermal layer, down into the dermis, we have these deeper dermal structures. And as well as that, there's other structures in the dermis. For example, is it fairly obvious that you're going to need a blood supply? So there's going to be arterioles, giving rise to groups of capillaries. When the blood has gone through the capillaries, it's going to drain in a venule. So the blood will drain from a venule. So oxygenated blood is going to enter via an arteriole, go through the capillaries and drain in a venule. So there is a blood supply in the dermis. But interestingly, there is no blood supply in the epidermis. And yet the epidermis is made up of living cells, at least the lower parts are. So on the bottom of the epidermis we've got a layer of cells where there's mitosis going on, forming new cells. And then as more cells form, there's not going to be enough space, so the older cells are going to be pushed up. And these cells eventually become flattened and are going to be sloughed off the surface. So we see that the epidermis is a strata of cells. There are layers of cells. And this is important because the epidermis is exposed to all of the rough and tumble at the surface of the body. It needs to be quite thick, so it needs to be strong. It's what you call a stratified epithelium. Stratified means in layers, in strata. Like in the earth, there's various stratas where things have happened in the past, like volcanoes or sedimentary formations, or whatever you see in the edge of quarries, the strata. So there's strata, there's layers of cells in the epidermis. It's a stratified epithelium. An epithelium is a tissue which lines. It is a lining tissue. It lines the surface of something. And in this case, of course, it's lining the surface of the body. And it's also rich in keratin. Now, keratin is the hard, horny material. For example, your fingernails are mostly keratin. And the surface of the skin is mostly keratin. So it's a keratinized, stratified epithelium. And actually, by the time the cells get to the surface of the epidermis, they're going to be fairly flattened like this. What do we call a cell which is flat? A flattened shaped cell? Well, a flat cell we call a squamous cell. So putting that together, we see that the epidermis is a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial layer. And there's living cells in the lower half of the epidermis. And yet we've just said that the epidermis doesn't have a blood supply. So how can there be living cells if there's no blood supply? Well, the answer is there's a good blood supply in the dermis below. Tissue fluid is formed in these capillaries. And the tissue fluid bathes the lower part of the epidermis. And through this tissue fluid, oxygen can go to the living cells. Nutrients like glucose and amino acids can go through to the living cells. Waste products like carbon dioxide can go from the living cells of the epidermis back into the tissue fluids of the dermis. And normally an epithelium is on a basement membrane. So we could call this a basement membrane. But in actual fact, this basement membrane between the dermis and the epidermis is actually incomplete. If you look at it under an electron microscope, there's gaps in it. Why do you think there might be gaps in it? Why not have a complete basement membrane for the epithelial layer, which is the epidermis? Well, we've said it hasn't got a blood supply, so if there's gaps in it, that's going to make it all the easier for oxygen and nutrients to diffuse through to the living cells. It's going to make it all the easier for carbon dioxide and other waste products to diffuse from the epidermis back into the dermis. So what we can call this bit here, not so much a basement membrane, but we call it a basement membrane zone. Yes, there is some basement membrane there, but there's other areas where there's not so much basement membrane. It's the basement membrane zone. So the dermis has an active blood supply. The epidermis is just nourished from the tissue fluids of the dermis. And also, there are various nerve receptors in the dermis. For example, there's branched receptors throughout the dermis, and these receptors are sensitive to pain. What do we call the nerve receptors that are sensitive to pain? Well, the nerve receptors that are sensitive to pain are called nociceptors. So these are nociceptors here. This is why the dermis is sensitive to pain. As you know, if you've ever had a burn or a graze, it hurts because it stimulates the pain receptors, the nociceptors of the dermis. And also in the dermis there's going to be other types of receptors. For example, there's going to be temperature receptors. Some detect hot, some detect cold. And then deeper down in the dermis there's going to be larger receptors, and these detect pressure. So we can be aware of pain, we can be aware of temperature, we can be aware of pressure, and the skin is also aware of light touch. So there's touch receptors, smaller receptors, nearer the surface of the dermis, but also there's some touch receptors actually in the very bottom layer of the epidermis. But apart from this, the epidermis contains no nerve fibres. The epidermis itself is not sensitive to pain. That all comes from the dermis below. And we notice that the line between the epidermis and the dermis is wavy. Let's think about why that might be. Well, here I've got two surfaces. Now let's suppose that this envelope represents the dermis and this represents the epidermis. Now, because these surfaces are flat, there's not much surface area between the two, and it's quite easy for one to simply slide off the other. But we don't want that. We don't want the epidermis to become disconnected from the dermis, because that would give us blisters. These would fill up with fluid and cause pain, damaging the epidermis, letting infection in. So it's more like some egg boxes really. So you can see that there's projections of the dermis go up into the epidermis, a bit like this egg box here, with these projections. And then the epidermis would be this layer here where it fits in like that. So now these two layers are fitted together. There's a large surface area between these two layers. So that means it's very hard for the epidermis to be sheared off from the dermis, making blistering much less likely to occur. And it also increases the surface area between the dermis and the epidermis to allow oxygenation and nutrition of the epidermis itself. Now, I've drawn the epidermis here as being on the surface, and that's true. There are epidermal cells lining the surface of the body. But the epidermis is not a two-dimensional layer. The epidermis is actually a three-dimensional layer. Because what the epidermis does is it dips down into the pores of the skin. So actually, what's happening here is that the surface layer, the epidermis, just colouring in there so we can see it. This is the epidermis. This actually goes right down into the lower layers of the skin. And indeed it goes right down, sometimes below the bottom of the skin, into the hypodermis. So epidermal cells are actually folding right down into the hair follicles. And likewise on the sweat glands. Epidermal cells are lining the sweat glands. At least the sweat gland ducts are lined by epidermis. So the epidermis is not flat, it's dipping down into the deep structures of the dermis, even dipping down into the hypodermis. And this is very important because, of course, the skin can become injured. There can be an abrasion where we scrape some off, or there can be a burn where some of the surface area of the skin is killed. And in fact, clinically we classify these. If an injury is affecting the dermis, like the injury is affecting the epidermis like this area is lost, we call that a superficial injury. Or if an injury is going down into the top part of the dermis and this part of the skin is lost, if that part of the skin is lost, we call that a superficial dermal injury or a superficial partial thickness injury. So for example, if this was burns we were talking about, that would be a superficial burn burning down to there. A partial thickness, a superficial partial thickness burn would be going part the way through the skin to the top layers of the dermis. Or if it was a deeper partial thickness injury, all this layer here could be lost. That would be a deeper partial thickness injury. Or even in some situations, all the thickness of the skin might be lost. And if it's all lost, that would be a full thickness injury. But let's think about the partial thickness injuries. Can you see if there's a partial thickness injury, all this surface layer of the epidermis is lost. Now if you pause for a minute and think about the principles of wound healing. Wounds can basically heal in one of two ways. They can heal by regeneration, or they can heal by fibrosis and repair. Now, if they're healing by fibrosis and repair, fibroblasts produce scar tissue and you're left with a scar. That's bad because you're left with a scar, but it's good because the injury is actually covered up. So it's good. It's a patch, if you like. But you can see it's much better to replace the original tissue. So if a tissue is lost, but there's some of that tissue left, then there can be mitosis and regeneration in the cells of the tissue that's left. And that can allow the tissue to heal by regenerating. It regenerates the tissue. So ideally, we want wounds to heal by regeneration rather than healing and fibrosis. But if we're going to heal by regeneration, we must have some of the original cells there to divide. It's like if you've got a box with no rabbits in it at all, you can't suddenly produce rabbits. But if you've got a couple of rabbits in the box, you can soon have as many rabbits as you like because they'll reproduce. Well, skin cells are the same. They will reproduce by mitosis. There can be mitotic regeneration. But if all of the surface area of the body is lost over a particular area of skin, if we lose all of the depth of the epidermis, as we do in partial thickness injuries, and we want the epidermis to regenerate, to grow back, then can you see that we need to have epidermal cells preserved in deeper structures to provide the raw material for that regeneration, the cells that can mitotically reproduce. So it's really clever that there are spare epidermal cells down here. So even if there's a deep partial thickness injury, there can be still healing by regeneration, meaning you have healing without scar tissue formation, because cells from deep in the dermal structures can divide. These cells will migrate up to the surface migrate over the surface and replace the epidermis that has been lost. It's kind of a like for like insurance policy. It's healing by regeneration. That means the body will have its own epidermal cells once again covering the skin, and you can get healing without scarring in that situation. So very important that you have these reserves of epidermal cells way down in the dermis in case of partial thickness injury. And we often see partial thickness injuries in clinical practice from abrasion and burns, and they are very painful. Why do you think it is that partial thickness injuries are so painful? Because they are very painful injuries. Well, we've said that there's no nociceptors, there's no pain receptors in the epidermis. And normally these pain receptors, these nociceptors, have got the epidermis on top, so they're not exposed. But if I come along with a piece of sandpaper and rub off the top of the skin, or you have an abrasion by rubbing your elbow on the road or something, then that means that the nociceptors are going to be exposed. And the exposed nociceptors generate a lot of pain. So we need to cover these with things that are going to soothe the nociceptors, and if necessary we're going to give the patient systemic painkillers, systemic analgesics as well. So we've got the epidermis, we've got the dermis, there's particular structures in the dermis. The dermis is actually a connective tissue. It contains collagen fibres and elastic fibres that help hold the whole thing together. But the epidermis is very dense, very rich in cells. So they're the three layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and below that, the hypodermis.